There is something about betrayal that breaks a person in a way that no other wound can. Not because of the pain itself, but because of who caused it. A stranger can hurt you and you walk away. But when it's someone who ate at the same table as you, someone who called you brother, someone who saw you grow up, that kind of wound doesn't just cut the skin. It cuts the identity. It makes you question everything you thought was real. And that is exactly where the story begins. Not in a palace, not in a moment of glory, but in a pit, a hole in the ground, surrounded by silence, surrounded by the sound of footsteps, walking away, surrounded by the absence of people who chose to leave. What you're about to hear is not just an ancient story. It is the blueprint of how God moves when everything in your life looks like it's falling apart. And the details of what actually happened, the real historical context, the culture, the geography, the politics, are going to change the way you see this story forever. We are talking about the land of Canaan, the ancient Near East, a region where family was not just a social unit. Family was survival. In that culture, around 1700 BCE, a man without his family was a man without protection, without land, without future. Tribe and clan were everything. The patriarch of a household held a power that was almost sacred. His blessing meant prosperity. His curse meant ruin. Within that context, being the firstborn or the favored son was not just an emotional matter. It carried legal and economic weight. The favored son would inherit the double portion. He would carry the family name forward. He would be the one who mattered in the structure of society. This is the world Jacob lived in. And Jacob had 12 sons. But everyone, absolutely everyone, knew which one was his favorite. Joseph, the son of Rachel, the wife Jacob had worked 14 years to marry. The son who received the coat of many colors. And that coat was not just a piece of clothing. In that time, a long-sleeved robe of that kind was a garment worn by people who did not work in the fields. It was the garment of someone who gave orders, not someone who obeyed them. When Jacob put that coat on Joseph, he was making a statement in a language every single one of his brothers could read. And they burned with it. They could not speak to Joseph without hatred spilling into their words. That tension had been building for years. And then Joseph had the dreams. In a culture where dreams were considered direct messages from the divine, where entire kingdoms made decisions based on what a man dreamed, Joseph's dreams were not just bizarre. They were declarations. He dreamed that his brothers' sheaves of grain bowed down to his. He dreamed that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bowed down to him. And then, and this is the part that still staggers me, he told them. He actually told them. Whether he was naive, whether he was bold, whether he was simply incapable of hiding what God had placed in him, we don't know entirely. What we know is that after those dreams, even his father rebuked him. Even Jacob, who loved him more than the others, said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" The text says Jacob kept the matter in mind. He didn't dismiss it. He stored it. But the brothers had already made their decision about Joseph long before the dreams. The dreams just finalized it. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were pasturing flocks near Shechem. A journey of roughly 60 miles through terrain that was harsh. Through roads that were not safe for a young man alone. Shechem itself was a loaded place. This was where the tribe of Jacob had a violent and complicated history, where the name of the family carried both fear and resentment. Joseph arrives. He can't find his brothers at first. A man in the field directs him to Dothan. And when his brothers saw him coming from a distance, that coat, catching whatever light was left in the afternoon, they didn't see their brother. They saw their problem. They saw the person who had claimed a future they wanted for themselves. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." The sarcasm in that last line is almost unbearable. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. They weren't just trying to kill a person. They were trying to kill a destiny. They wanted to prove, with his dead body, that God's promises mean nothing. Reuben, the oldest, stepped in. The oldest son had a particular responsibility in that culture. And Reuben, who had already failed his father once in a devastating way, may have been trying to redeem himself. He suggested they throw Joseph in the cistern, without killing him, planning to come back and rescue him later. So they took Joseph. They stripped him of that coat, and they threw him into the cistern. The text says the cistern was empty, with no water in it. And then they sat down and ate. They sat down and had a meal, while their brother was at the bottom of a pit calling out to them. We know this because Joseph, years later, would remind them, "I pleaded with you and you would not listen." He was screaming. They were eating. And that image right there, is one of the most violent silences in all of Scripture. Not because of what was done, because of what was not done. Because of the choice to chew bread and swallow it down while a voice you know screams beneath your feet. A caravan appeared on the road. Ishmaelites, traders coming from Gilead, carrying spices, balm, and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. Judah looked at the caravan and then looked at the pit, and something shifted in him. Not compassion, calculation. What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? He said, "Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." That last part, our own flesh and blood, is almost more disturbing than if he had stayed silent. He acknowledged Joseph's humanity in the same breath that he negotiated a price for it. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. 20. That was the going rate for a young male slave in that period. We can verify this from ancient Near Eastern texts, from Mesopotamian records, from the very economic systems that governed commerce in Canaan and Egypt at the time. 20 pieces of silver, and Joseph was taken down into Egypt. Egypt in this period, broadly within the Second Intermediate Period, or Late Middle Kingdom, was one of the most complex, powerful, and administratively sophisticated societies in the ancient world. The Nile made Egypt possible. The annual flooding deposited rich black soil. The Egyptians called it Kemet, the Black Land, and that agricultural wealth generated surpluses that funded armies, monuments, bureaucracies, and an economy that pulled in traders and slaves from across the ancient world. Egypt needed labor constantly. The construction projects, the agricultural work, the domestic service in elite households, all of it required a vast workforce, much of which came from people exactly like Joseph. Foreigners, captured or purchased, brought in through established trade routes. Joseph was not unusual in this regard. He was one of thousands, and that anonymity is part of what makes what happens next so extraordinary. He was bought by a man named Potiphar, an Egyptian official. The text identifies him as the captain of the guard, which in the Egyptian court structure placed him close to Pharaoh's personal security and household administration. This was not a minor position. Potiphar had access, influence, and resources. And Joseph, thrown into this household with nothing, no language advantage at first, no family, no reputation, no coat, began to work. The text says that the Lord was with Joseph and that he prospered, and that his master saw this and put him in charge of his entire household. But let's not move past that too quickly. There is a gap in the narrative that we don't always sit with. That transition from foreign slave to trusted household manager didn't happen overnight. It took years of invisible faithfulness, years of doing small things well when no one was watching, and there was no reason to believe it would ever matter. That is the part the story compresses into a few verses, but that Joseph had to live day by day, season by season, with no indication that any of it was going somewhere. And then Potiphar's wife. The account in Genesis 39 is blunt and precise. She pursued him repeatedly. Day after day, and day after day, Joseph refused. His refusal was not merely moral posturing. It was rooted in a coherent understanding of loyalty and conscience. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He said, in an Egyptian household, in a culture where the gods of Egypt demanded ritual, correctness, but where personal ethics looked very different from what Joseph had inherited. His reference to his God in this context was itself a kind of quiet declaration of who he was. He had lost everything external. He had not lost himself, but that faithfulness cost him. She grabbed his garment. The word used echoes the stripping of the coat in Dothan, and that parallel is not accidental, and he fled, leaving it in her hands. She used it to build a lie. And Potiphar, who almost certainly understood more than the text says he believed, had Joseph thrown into prison. Not just any prison. The text specifies it was the place where the king's prisoners were confined. This detail matters. Joseph wasn't thrown into a common jail. He was placed in a royal detention facility, which in Egypt's administrative structure meant a specific kind of confinement, controlled, monitored, but also populated by people connected to Pharaoh's court. This is not coincidence. This is positioning. Not that Joseph knew that. Joseph knew only that he was innocent and that he was in a cell. 2 years passed after the moment he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh's cupbearer correctly and asked to be remembered. 2 years of waiting for a door that didn't open. 2 years of watching the one person who had seen what he could do simply forget about him. In Egyptian culture, the ability to interpret dreams was associated with divine favor and priestly knowledge. What Joseph had done in that prison was, by Egyptian standards, something that belonged to the sages, to the trained interpreters of royal dreams. And yet here was this Hebrew slave doing it accurately, without ceremony, without ritual, without the tools of the trade. He just knew, and knowing didn't get him out. Those 2 years are the part of the story, I think, we rush past because they make us uncomfortable. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're not. 2 years of ordinary days. 2 years of waking up in the same cell, seeing the same walls, hearing the same sounds, asking the same questions with no answer coming back. This is the part of the story that every person who has ever prayed and heard nothing will recognize. The silence that doesn't feel like preparation, the wait that feels like abandonment, the gap between promise and fulfillment, where your only evidence that God is still present is the fact that you are still breathing and still here. Joseph didn't have a narrator telling him this was all leading somewhere. He had the walls and the waiting, and he stayed. Pharaoh had a dream, 2 dreams. Actually, in a single night, and the way the ancient Egyptians treated royal dreams tells us everything about what happened next. Pharaoh's dreams were not personal events. They were state events. A ruler who dreamed and could not understand his dream was a ruler whose gods had spoken and whose court had failed to translate. The magicians and wise men of Egypt were summoned, and they could not interpret the dreams. And it was at that exact moment, that moment of institutional failure in the most powerful court on earth, that the cupbearer remembered. Today I am reminded of my shortcomings, he said, and he told Pharaoh about the Hebrew man in prison who had interpreted dreams with an accuracy that could not be explained. Joseph was shaved because appearing before Pharaoh unshaved was unacceptable in Egyptian court protocol. Given clean clothes and brought before the most powerful man in the known world. What Pharaoh described was 2 visions. 7 fat cows swallowed by 7 thin cows, 7 full heads of grain, consumed by 7 thin and scorched heads. Joseph listened and then said something that, in that context, would have sounded almost dangerous. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. In a court full of priests dedicated to Ammonius, Ra, Osiris, and dozens of other deities, Joseph named a different god entirely and then gave in interpretations so clear, so actionable, and so immediately credible that Pharaoh did not dismiss him. 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine. Store grain during the good years, or the famine will devastate not just Egypt, but the surrounding regions as well. And then, without ceremony, without political maneuvering, without any of the usual pathways to power in that society, Pharaoh looked at his officials and said, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" He put Joseph in charge of the entire land of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. He placed his own signet ring on Joseph's finger, dressed him in fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and gave him an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. He gave him a wife. He gave him a life. And it happened in one day. Think about the mathematics of that. Joseph was 17 when his brothers threw him in the pit. He was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh. 13 years. 13 years of slavery, accusation, imprisonment, and silence between the dream and the throne. In those 13 years, he built administrative competence in Potiphar's household. He developed the capacity to manage complex systems under pressure. He learned Egyptian, the language, the culture, the bureaucratic structure. He learned how power worked in that world. He learned patience that was not passive but active, not defeated but focused. Every door that shut on him was preparing him for a door that required everything he had become. The pit made him desperate enough to hold on to God. The slavery made him competent enough to manage a nation. The prison placed him in proximity to Pharaoh's court. None of it was wasted. Not one day of it. The famine came exactly as Joseph had said. It spread across the whole region, Canaan included. And back in Canaan, a father named Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt and sent his sons to buy food. All of them except Benjamin, the youngest, Rachel's other son. The one Jacob had kept close after losing Joseph. The brothers traveled to Egypt and stood before the official who oversaw the distribution of grain across the known world. They bowed, and the dreamer looked at his brothers, bowing before him and recognized them immediately. But they didn't recognize him. He was no longer a 17-year-old boy in a coat. He was an Egyptian official with a shaved head, speaking through an interpreter, dressed in linen and gold. The fulfillment of the dream looked absolutely nothing like what any of them, including Joseph, would have imagined. And Joseph wept, not once but multiple times during those subsequent encounters, privately, turning away so no one would see. That detail reveals something about what those years had cost him emotionally. Something the structure of the narrative almost hides beneath its efficiency. He was not a man who had moved on. He was a man who had held on. And holding on had cost him something that even the gold chain around his neck couldn't replace. When he finally revealed himself to his brothers, he could have destroyed them. He had the power, the authority, and arguably the legal justification. Instead, he said, "Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He reframed the entire story. Not by denying what they did. He didn't pretend it wasn't real or that it hadn't hurt, but by insisting that what God was doing was bigger than what they had done. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That is not a small statement. That is a man standing on the other side of 13 years of silence and suffering and saying, "I see it now. I see why." If you're somewhere in the middle of your own story right now, if you're in the pit or in Potiphar's house, or in the prison, or in the 2 years of waiting with no one remembering your name, this is what I want you to sit with. Joseph never knew when it would end. He never had the chapter headings. He just had the days. And he kept showing up in them faithfully, not because he could see the ending, but because he hadn't stopped believing there was one. That kind of faith is not loud. It doesn't post about itself. It just keeps getting up. It just keeps doing the next right thing in whatever room it's currently locked in. If something in this story reached you today, if it reminded you of something you've been carrying, something you've been waiting on, something you almost gave up believing was still possible, drop it in the comments. Not just amen, if that's not what you actually feel. Tell us where you are in your story. Some of the most powerful things in this community happen when one person is honest and someone else reads it and realizes they're not alone. We read everything. We're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the button is right there. And it costs nothing, but it means we get to keep making things like this for you. We're building something here together. A place for people who take these stories seriously, who want the history, the culture, the real context, not just the Sunday morning version. If that's you, stay with us. We're just getting started.